They told me to get out of their lives, and for once, I did exactly as I was told. I drove away with a car full of boxes and a spine made of splinters, certain I was headed toward the edge of the world. I thought grief had already emptied me the day we buried my husband Levi. Yet the worst part came after, when a tidy voice in a law office turned my life into bullet points, and my daughter-in-law turned those points into a verdict. I was a widow with an address, but no home, a mother with a son who would not look up, and a woman who would learn that exile can be the beginning of something fierce. My name is Mildred Morrison, and 3 days after Levi's funeral, I sat in a leather chair that smelled like old books and disappointment while Mr. Henderson read the will. My son Quinn shifted in his suit as if the fabric accused him. Beside him, his wife Maisie inspected her perfect nails and sighed loudly enough to slice the room in half. When the attorney reached the line that left me the ranch on Willow Creek Road, Maisie rolled her eyes and said, "I should go play farmer and be useful for once the way some people say, pass the salt." Her smile was the kind that counts ceiling tiles while you speak. Quinn kept his eyes on his hands. The boy I once rocked through thunderstorms let his wife speak for him, and I learned in that moment how silence can be a knife. I did not argue. I gathered my purse, I rose, and I left, with my dignity folded as carefully as a handkerchief in my pocket. The house where I had lived for 37 years shrank in the rearview mirror, while Maisie watched from a window with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully reorganized a closet. The road to the ranch was a ribbon of dust and regret 40 minutes beyond town, past wind-gnawed fences and grass that remembered better rains. I had visited rarely. Levi always waved me away from its history with a dismissive line about junk and spiders. Now it was mine, and I arrived at dusk to find a porch that sagged like an old back and a key still tucked under the loose board where he had always kept it. Inside the house breathed out decades of neglect. Dust floated in slanting light furniture slept under white shrouds, and every footstep answered with a hollow echo. I sat in the dim living room and let the sobs come, not the careful tears I saved for church or neighbors, but the kind that come from somewhere deep where a name echoes long after the person is gone. I cried for Levi, for the woman I had been, for the photo albums Maisie called knickknacks, and for a motherhood turned into an accusation. Then I made a quiet promise to survive, to rebuild, to find a way to become someone who could not be dismissed with an eye roll. The first week nearly broke me, which is another way of saying it began to make me. I cleaned like a person learning a language again, room by room, stain by stain, sentence by sentence. Beneath dust covers, I found Levi's childhood intact in corners he had never mentioned. A glass case of arrowheads arranged with reverence. Shelves lined with geology books that smelled of mineral and ink. Rock samples tagged in block letters I recognized from his grocery lists. In the pantry behind a loose board, I discovered a tin box tied with string. The lid opened on letters written in Spanish by a woman named Elena in the 1940s. Their ink faded, but their heat intact. She wrote of love and land, of surveys and a secret beneath the earth, and her photograph showed a young beauty standing beside a man who looked like Levi's grandfather, Samuel Morrison. The past did not whisper from those pages. It breathed. I called the one person in town who remembered more than anyone, Ruth Peaton, whose memory was a card catalog of everybody's business. She told me Samuel had chased copper, once maybe silver, that he filed claims and surveyed the ranch before the war, and after that, he married a Mexican girl named Elena, who died in childbirth, and that grief turned him into a hermit with a pickaxe. When Samuel died, the land went to Levi's father, and then to Levi, and somewhere along the way, the town forgot about minerals and veins and the restless hope of ore. I hung up and stared at the ranch as darkness gathered, wondering how a secret can sleep under your feet for decades and still wake up hungry. Curiosity is a kind of courage. Sometimes it is also a flashlight. On a gray morning, I opened the basement door I had always avoided and went down creaking steps into cool earth air, my beam skimming across stone walls older than our marriage. Tools lay on a bench, picks, hammers, instruments with brass faces, and needles steady as a held breath. In the far corner behind crates, an opening yawned in the foundation, timbered and deliberate, a tunnel no storm had made. A draft flowed from its dark mouth, carrying a metallic scent that tasted like a penny on my tongue. I did not crawl inside. A woman can be brave without being foolish. But I knew then that Levi's dismissals had not been about spiders. He had been standing guard over a door. I opened crates next. Most were empty, but one resisted my tug. Inside, wrapped in rough canvas, were rocks threaded with green and blue veins. I scratched one with a nail file, and a bright streak answered the light. The last crate hid a leather portfolio tied with string. I spread its contents on the workbench and saw the ranch with new eyes survey maps marked with confident hand copies of mineral rights filings, correspondence with government offices, and most startling professional geological reports from only a few years ago, under the name Morrison Geological Associates. The language was technical, but even grief can read a verdict when it's written in plain numbers. Significant copper deposit, one summary concluded. Excellent commercial potential, another said, as if the land itself had been waiting patiently for me to learn its grammar. I carried the portfolio upstairs and laid it across the kitchen table, where years of family dinners had once clattered. The farmhouse no longer felt like exile. It felt like a hinge. I looked out the window toward the windmill and realized that if the past held a tunnel, the future might hold a way through. At the kitchen table, the papers formed a topography of possibility, and somewhere between the maps and the signatures, my fear loosened its grip. I found a letter dated only months before Levi's last hospital stay, a clean corporate header from Southwestern Mining Corporation, offering to lease mineral rights for an upfront payment that made my breath hiccup $2 million with royalties thereafter. At the bottom of the folder, a page in Levi's unsettled handwriting steadied me more than any survey ever could. Mildred deserves better, he had written. This is for her. Don't let that woman ruin it. He could not bring himself to write Maisie's name, but I felt the shape of it in the ink. Grief and anger arranged themselves into something practical. I dialed the number on the letterhead at 9 a.m., introduced myself, and listened as a professional voice brightened with recognition. Yes, they were still interested, perhaps more than before, given market conditions. Could they send a team for a preliminary visit on Tuesday at 10 a.m.? I said yes, and felt a current of resolve move through me like power returning to a house after a storm. In the days before the visit, I studied. I brewed tea at 6 a.m., propped my laptop on the kitchen counter, and taught myself the grammar of leases and royalties, surface rights, and subsurface claims, easements, and reclamation plans. Words that once would have made my eyes fog feasibility study, concentrate. Grade tailings, management became stones I could step on to cross a river. I called a mineral rights attorney whose biography on the State Bar website telegraphed steel beneath courtesy. Patricia Wells answered at 3 p.m., heard a summary of my situation, and offered to review any documents I received before I signed a single page. You are holding the leverage, she said, calm as a metronome. Act like it. On Tuesday, the ranch road lifted a tail of dust behind a white pickup that looked all business. A man with weather on his face introduced himself as Frank Torres, and a younger woman with keen eyes and a tablet introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen. They treated me as if I belonged at the center of the conversation, which I did. We walked the property edges, while Frank translated the language of rocks into the language of years, and Sarah showed me a digital map where the copper seam drew a diagonal through my land like a secret vein of fire. Near the old basement tunnel, Frank tipped his hat toward history. Whoever started this had a good nose, he said. Your husband's grandfather, maybe. He followed the line nearly perfect. Back at the kitchen table, he set out terms with the steadiness of someone who has done this 100 times, but still respects the one time it matters most to the person across from him. Given current prices and what we know, he said, we're prepared to offer $4 million up front for a 20-year lease plus quarterly royalties. We expect to average between $300,000 and $500,000, depending on grade and throughput. I kept my face even, but inside I felt tumblers turning. I told them any agreement would go first to my attorney. Frank nodded. That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. That afternoon, the silence I had once feared felt like space opening. I printed the draft contract on the old machine in the study and drove into town for legal-size paper and better pens, the kind that glide. Back at the ranch, as the light thinned, my phone lit up with Quinn's name. I stared a long moment and then answered. His voice had the cautious softness of a boy who knows he has stayed out past curfew. He wanted to know how I was settling in, which meant he wanted to talk about money. Property taxes were due. A kitchen renovation had a deposit coming. Perhaps I could help temporarily. It would not have touched the second decimal of the smallest royalty check being teased across my table. I asked if he was happy. He stumbled. Of course I am, he said, which is a sentence that often means its opposite. I told him a partner should make you bigger, not smaller. The line went quiet, as if the house on his end had exhaled. That night, I did not sleep as a widow. I slept as a woman rehearsing a new spine. At 7 a.m., I called Patricia, forwarded the draft, and by 11 a.m., she had already annotated the margins with notes sharp enough to cut through any mist of flattery. She praised the reclamation plan and struck a clause that smuggled risk onto my porch. We'll negotiate a tighter royalty floor, she said. Your deposit is not average, and you should not be paid as if it were. I made coffee and read each note twice until the contract began to read like a promise I could live with. News has its own weather. By mid-afternoon, word had reached the county that mineral rights once associated with Samuel's larger tract had never been transferred to the tiny suburban lot where Quinn's house sat. The bank had questions. So did Maisie, whose texts arrived like hail. She wanted to clear the air, which meant she wanted to clear the books with my money. I let the phone ring as I learned the history of severed estates and how a deed can look complete, while the earth below it belongs to someone else. When Quinn finally reached me at 5 p.m., his voice carried the strained politeness of a man trying to keep a table from wobbling. We might need some help, he said. I told him help is most useful when it teaches a person to stand up. We were both quiet after that, but for the first time since the reading of the will, the quiet did not hurt. I signed nothing that week. I reread everything. I walked the perimeter at 6 p.m. while swallows scribbled the sky and thought about the difference between being needed and being valued. I put Levi's note in my pocket and felt its small weight against my leg like a permission slip. When I finally phoned Southwestern at 10 a.m. the next day to confirm our intent to proceed pending counsel's revisions, Sarah sounded genuinely pleased. You're making a good decision, she said. I told her I was making a deliberate one. The distinction mattered. The contract was signed on a Thursday afternoon in a downtown office where the windows gleamed like mirrors and the pens felt heavier than they should. Patricia slid the final page across her mahogany desk with a nod. In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen terms this favorable, she said, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself smile. When my name curved across the paper, I felt something inside me shift, as if all the years of sacrifice and dismissal had locked me in a narrow corridor, and suddenly the door swung open. I walked out of that office worth more than all the people who had cast me aside, but it wasn't the number in the contract that lifted my chin. It was the knowledge that I had finally chosen for myself. 2 weeks later, at exactly 11 a.m., The first payment landed in the account I had opened solely for this purpose. $4 million written out in neat electronic digits, humming quietly behind a screen. Patricia's advisor helped me set up a second account for royalties investments that would grow, while I decided what kind of life I wanted next. For the first time in decades, the future was not a matter of stretching coupons or pinching hope, it was a matter of design. That night, I drank wine on the porch and let the quiet settle, not as punishment, but as peace. Quinn called 17 times that week. The first messages were anxious, then urgent, then almost panicked. "Mom, we got a notice from the county," he said in one voicemail. "They're saying the mineral rights under our property never transferred. The bank's asking questions. We need to talk." Maisie's voice followed in another stripped of its usual sharpness. "Mildred, whatever game you're playing, it has to stop. This is about family." The word rang hollow. Family had been a door they closed in my face. Now it was a banner they waved when their mortgage trembled. I let the messages pile up like junk mail. Eventually, I answered one of Quinn's calls. He launched into the story how the bank might raise their interest rate, how legal fees were impossible, how maybe if we merged properties, it could all be easier. "We could build you an apartment over the garage," he offered, as if I should be grateful for the chance to live above their cars. I asked him carefully who would control the mining lease in such an arrangement. Silence answered for him. "That's what I thought," I said, and before he could plead again, I hung up. My phone lit with Maisie's number seconds later, but I ignored it. For the first time in 40 years, I wasn't afraid of their silence. I had found my own. The mining crews arrived on schedule, efficient men and women who treated the land with a reverence I hadn't expected. Trucks came at 7 a.m., equipment followed, and by noon, the ranch hummed with a new rhythm metal on rock voices, calling measurements reports drafted under portable lights. I watched them from the porch, coffee warming my hands, and thought about Samuel, about Levi, about Elena, and about all the Morrison women who had been asked to make do with less. That cycle ended here. The windmill creaked in the distance like a metronome, but the song it kept time for was mine now. The first quarterly royalty check arrived at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday in September. $437,000 clean and indisputable, printed on paper, so official, it seemed to carry its own authority. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, not for the money itself, but for what it meant: permanence, independence, a future of my own choosing. I paid off Levi's medical bills without hesitation, not because I had to, but because I chose to. That difference felt like oxygen. I hired contractors to renovate the ranch with respect for its bones, solar panels on the roof, a new kitchen that smelled of cedar and lemon central heat that sighed through the vents like forgiveness. The house became a home again, not the one I had left, but one entirely mine. Months passed, and Quinn's calls began to change. The desperation softened into awkward attempts at conversation. He told me his youngest daughter had lost a tooth, asked for my pot roast recipe, mentioned that the children missed their grandmother. I answered sometimes, not always, but often enough that a thread began to weave between us again. Maisie, on the other hand, grew sharper in her absence. Our last conversation had been a tirade about manipulation and betrayal, to which I responded with calm clarity: if your husband is reconsidering his priorities, perhaps examine your own behavior. She hung up on me, and I let that silence stand. Quinn later admitted their marriage was crumbling. Renovation plans, abandoned debts, multiplying therapy sessions attended alone. "I'm learning about boundaries," he said during one of our gentler calls. "The difference between supporting someone and enabling them." I did not remind him that I had tried to teach him that lesson for years. Some truths must be learned in fire. One evening, as the sun burned orange at 6 p.m., he left a voicemail I replayed 3 times. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about being the man you raised me to be. I'm trying. I love you, and I'm sorry for everything. His words were not currency this time. They were confession. When I called back, I asked about Emma's honor roll, about Tommy's soccer finals, about the lives of the grandchildren I still longed to hold. "They miss you," Quinn said simply. "We all do." He admitted he and Maisie were separated. I told him I was proud of him for choosing respect over control. He asked if I had ever considered sharing the mining money with them. I answered honestly for 5 minutes yes, but I realized bailing them out would only preserve the habits that hurt them. Sometimes love means letting people face consequences. The silence that followed was not bitter. It was the silence of understanding. By the end of that year, the ranch was more than profitable, it was alive. I took classes in photography and geology, traveled to Santa Fe to learn about the cultures tied to this land, and discovered that living for oneself is not selfishness, but survival. The copper beneath my feet became wealth in my hands, but the true treasure was reclaiming my own worth. The woman who had left a law office in tears was gone. In her place stood someone unafraid to say no, someone who understood that being valued and being needed are not the same. 6 months after signing the lease, I sat on the ranch porch at 7 a.m., with coffee in hand, watching the sun climb over the mountains, painting them in gold and purple. The hum of mining equipment carried faintly from the far ridge, steady as a heartbeat, a reminder that the land beneath me was no longer sleeping. A thick envelope from Southwestern Mining rested on the table beside me. Inside was another quarterly check, $437,000, crisp and undeniable. I no longer gasped when I saw the numbers. I set the check aside and reached for my coffee instead. Security had become routine, and with it came a freedom I had not known even as a young woman. Life at the ranch unfolded with new rhythms. Contractors had restored the old farmhouse with care, solar panels on the roof, internet strong enough for research and investment calls. A kitchen that gleamed with polished counters, but still smelled like cinnamon when I baked. I filled the rooms with photographs I had begun taking after a community class, revealed an eye I didn't know I possessed. Landscapes of mesas at dusk, deer at the creek at 6 p.m., even close-ups of the copper-veined rocks that had changed my life. I traveled too, spending a week in Santa Fe to study Native American history, taking geology courses at the community college, so I could finally understand the language of ore and strata. For the first time in decades, I was not someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's grandmother in the shadows. I was simply Mildred, a woman allowed to be whole. The calls from Quinn shifted further over time. He no longer asked for money, only for conversations. He told me about Emma's passion for science and Tommy's soccer victories, about his own clumsy efforts at single parenting since Maisie had left. "She made me choose between her and you," he admitted one evening at 8 p.m. "And I told her anyone who makes me choose between the people I love doesn't understand love at all." His voice cracked when he said it, but it was the sound of a man learning to stand upright again. I told him I was proud, and I meant it. For years, I had been accused of failing as a mother. Now I saw proof that sometimes success looks like letting someone fall before they learn to rise. Maisie faded like a stain washed too many times. After our final bitter exchange in February, she stopped calling altogether. From what Quinn shared, her departure was more storm than farewell, but I did not press. Her voice had been the wedge that drove my son's eyes away from mine. Now without her, I found fragments of the boy I once knew peeking through. When he asked if he could bring the children to visit, I said yes, without hesitation. "They miss you," he told me. "We all do." And when the car pulled into the ranch driveway one bright Saturday at 10 a.m., Emma and Tommy tumbled out, running toward me with arms open, shouting, "Grandma," as if no time had passed at all. I bent to gather them, tears stinging my eyes, and for once they were tears of gain, not loss. We spent that weekend walking the land, baking cookies in the renovated kitchen, and exploring the edges of the mining site from a safe distance. I showed them the windmill that still turned like an old friend, the creek where deer grazed at dawn, and the porch swing where I began each morning. At night, when they slept in freshly painted rooms smelling faintly of pine, I sat with Quinn on the porch, and we talked not of debts or disappointments, but of memories, dreams, and the slow art of repairing trust. He asked me if I had ever regretted not sharing the mining windfall earlier. I told him the truth, that I had considered it briefly, but realized bailing him out would have robbed him of the lesson he had finally begun to learn. He nodded, silent, and the quiet between us was no longer hostile. It was healing. The ranch became more than property. It became proof that reinvention is possible at any age. The community began to call it the strike at Willow Creek, a case study for geology students and mining journals alike. Sarah Chen even presented our site at a national conference, texting me afterward. "Your property is famous now. They're calling you the woman who struck gold at 69. I laughed and texted back, "Copper, not gold, but close enough." The title made me smile, not because of the wealth, but because of the reminder that life still held surprises worth living for. In the mirror, I no longer saw the widow who left the law office in tears, or the mother dismissed as clutter in her son's home. I saw a woman with lines on her face, carved by grief, but deepened by wisdom. I saw someone who understood that being useful is not the same as being valued, and that family, to mean anything, must be built on respect. I had learned that exile can be the soil where strength grows, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living fully on your own terms. To those listening now, I ask you this: what would you do if the world told you that you had nothing left, only to discover a hidden fortune in your foundation? Have you ever been pushed aside, only to rise stronger than before? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to know how far these lessons can reach. And if my journey moved, you please like, share, and subscribe, so more people can discover that it is never too late to reclaim your worth.